Good evening. I'd like to call the special meeting of the Pelham Board of Education of April 14th, 2021 to order. Would everybody please rise to the pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So welcome to our special meeting. I want to thank the board for availing themselves to another board meeting 2 weeks in a row, and we'll be meeting again next week. So I guess that makes it 3 weeks in a row. And I also want to thank the administrative team and specifically Mr. Ricky for all of the hard work this past week. I know there's a lot that got dumped on your plate right in time for our board meeting last week, and we're looking forward to updates that you've learned and what news you can share with us and how it relates to our budget. So I will turn it over to our main item, which is our budget discussion.
Thank you. If I'm not speaking loud enough, please let me know. Give me a thumbs up. Gets a little echoey here, so I think if I keep my volume down, you'll get less back from the echo. Thank you. So really, last time the board met, we were less than 24 hours into getting updated budget information from the state. And at that point in time, we really didn't know a heck of a lot about the details behind some of the funding that we received. And just to kind of bring everyone up to date, the district was, and most districts in the state, did have a favorable experience from the state in state budget or state aid for next year. Based on the state aid budget runs, the school district is anticipated to receive an additional $1.649 million next year. And that's really terrific. And what this has done is I'd like you to think of that $1.6 million kind of in two different buckets, of equal buckets of about $800,000. The first $800,000 of it is based on federal funding and the federal act that was passed, and it's really direct funding related to COVID, to address learning recovery, learning loss, support for COVID, and for the shutdown with schools. And that's really the intended purpose of those monies. They're not intended to be to come every year, so it's really a one-time expense that the federal government is granting to the school district. And that intended purpose pretty clearly is that those funds are not to supplant existing dollars. So really we can't use it to pay for, our first grade. It just to kind of make a very obvious explanation of it. It's really to address those additional things, those added things that our students need as a result of this past year. And obviously with that, it can't be, the intended purpose is not to offset or to delay any tax increases. In addition, those monies are also by state rules to be held in the state in the district special aid fund, excuse me. So that's really not part of the budget that we've been discussing as part of what comes before the community. So I just want to help everyone understand that's kind of half of what that $1.6 million increase is.
Jim, I have one quick question because we haven't talked a lot about the special aid fund in prior meetings. So can you just give everyone a really quick description of what that is?
Sure. The special aid fund is really where we account for things like, our federal grants. So you may hear us say title funds sometimes. Those are funds allocated to the district for students that have need factors, whether it's special education, early language learners, if they're economically disadvantaged, those types of need factors. It's also where we account for what we would call our IDEA funds. And those are funds that are additional funds that the federal government provides so that we can provide additional supports directly for our special education students. Julia, is that a fair explanation? it's simple, but I think it's a pretty simple explanation for everyone to kind of get an idea of where that special aid, what that special aid fund is used for.
And is it correct? I seem to remember from our line by line budget meetings that sometimes items in Julia's category of the budget get partially funded by these type of grants and partially funded by our regular operating budget. Is that correct?
That is correct. And Julia, I don't know if you'd like to share what a couple of those types of items could be.
Yeah, sure. We also will fund possibly some materials for like programs. We also use a great deal of that money for professional development for our special education teachers and related service providers. Sometimes we may need some consultants, and we may use the IDEA funds for the consultants as well. So it just depends year to year, but a good chunk of it does go to potentially some of the consultants or related service providers, and sometimes we might pay for some of our teaching assistants out of that of the IDEA fund. So it's we do use it, and it's helpful because it helps with, it's beyond the regular operating budget. So
yeah.
Jim,
And
sorry. Go ahead,
Go
Cheryl.
ahead, Leah. No, I think you go ask your question, and then I'll share some information.
Thank you. I missed the beginning of what you said, Jim. Did you say that Title I funds go into this as well?
Yes, our Title I fund. So those are students who have specific needs. And they could be English language learners, special education students, economically disadvantaged. And there's a fourth factor in there. I can't remember. I apologize. I think there are 4 factors of need.
Academic intervention need.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jim, just a question. So this special aid fund lives within our general fund, but it's only can be used for certain things. Is that correct?
Well, it can only be used for certain things. That's correct, and it's actually not even in our general fund. It's a fund separate and distinct from our general fund.
But it shows up in as part of our every year. It shows up in our expenditure line, and it shows up in our fund line, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, Jackie, do you mind popping in and sharing the example on where we would see it?
Yeah, it's actually a whole separate fund. I'm sorry, you able to hear me? Yes?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. It's actually a separate fund that we account for. It shows up in our annual financial statements. So you would see it there. So you would see the general fund reported separately. Cafeteria fund is another example, federal fund, debt service fund. But it's a whole separate fund in and of itself.
You're probably, and I know you see it every month with the treasurer reports. You'll see it there too. When we report on that. So it's probably where it's familiar from where you've seen it previously.
But it would not show up within the budget itself. It would
Correct,
not be
correct.
reflected as a revenue or an expenditure within the general fund budget.
That was my question.
Correct. That's correct.
Right.
Not there. Yeah.
It's not there.
So I won't see that in the 63 million or whatever the number is.
No, you won't.
No. And those allocations are provided by the state on a whole different time frame. Steve handles the title grants, titles, I think 1, 2, 3, 4. Julia handles 611, 619, and they are actually applied for to the state over the summer. I believe August 30th, somewhere in that neighborhood is the deadline for those. And then those funds are allocated by the state, awarded based on the grant application. A lot of different restrictions around those. What I was going to say, Julia's description kind of gives me a good segue to some initial thoughts that we've had for those funds. Since it can't be part of our general fund, it can't go towards reducing the tax burden. It really is supplemental, additional items, not supplanting anything that is already in the budget. We have some thoughts about where we want to spend it. We certainly are still waiting for additional information to come out about exactly what it can be spent on and how the process and procedure will go. But we already know if we have a need to continue, if we have a need to continue with virtual teaching in the fall, I think we've very vividly learned this year of the need of having fully virtual teachers. So that's one idea of where we would likely put those funds. I think we're all very concerned as well about social emotional wellness and transition back to school in the coming year. and helping students to really recover in that way. So, potentially some increased clinicians, at the elementary as well as the secondary level. We certainly would have to do that in a one-time approach, though. Those could not be permanent positions. Those would have to be maybe, independent contractors, professional services contracted for the year, something of that nature, because of these funds being one-time funds. But again, we're still waiting for that. There could also be additional funding, additional uses for, summer programming, things like that. And Jim, I don't remember if you mentioned it, but with that particular fund, some of the funds within it, we can use it over numerous years. So that's
That was
another
my
really
next
good
question.
thing. Yeah.
Yes.
So if we identify something like we wanted to run learning programs over a couple of years, we could spend some in the first year and retain some of those funds for future years. I think it was through 2024.
It's actually two different grants. So one grant has a run out to 2023 and the other one can run out to 2024. So it gives you some longevity on that if you needed to.
Eileen, did you have? Sorry. Eileen had her hand up. Sorry.
Sorry. I was going to ask about the status on summer, and then Cheryl said it right after I was thinking it. But I assume also whatever is the appropriate portion of this money would go to this summer.
Yeah, and then once we get clarity on what we can spend it on and how, we're gonna prioritize those needs. We do have some funds built into our general fund that we had already planned for increased summer programming, knowing the needs that we are likely presenting. So Steve's working with the directors and the principal on designing what those programs may look like. So we do have some already allocated from our own funds, but this could be something to supplement that as well if needed.
I don't know if everybody saw the article about the New York City Department of Education and their summer plans, which are impressive, especially for as many people as they're going to be doing them for. So hoping we can do the Pelham version.
Well, we also have to consider who's actually showing up too. So
right.
We spent tens of thousands of dollars on programs last summer with that very few students access. So we have to be prudent with our experiences and target them as well. Right. And the administrators are working. It's going to take a little time, but try to, as Dr. Champ likes to say, we like to under-promise and over-perform, or what is it? Yeah, something like that, right?
Over-deliver.
Over-deliver, yeah. So, I guess that's the framework we're going to try to use.
Just a question, how big is this special aid fund in a typical year? Is it $10 and now we've added $831,000 to it? Or is it $1 million and now we've added $831,000 to it?
I don't have that number in front of me right now. I can certainly follow up with the board tomorrow with what the total amounts are, because then we're going to have to add it all up.
It's not a critical question. I was just curious.
Sure. We'll follow up with the board. Happy to do that. So as we look at the $1.6 million, again, divided into basically two equal portions, that kind of lets you know where that half of that is going into that special aid fund that we just talked about. The other half of it, I want you to think of, that's the increase in our foundation funding from the state, which is terrific, because over the years, there's been great advocacy in Pelham and a lot of discussion about how the district has not been receiving nearly close to full funding of foundation aid. In fact, we were close to just over, some years we were under 50%. I think we were just over, a little bit over 50% of our calculated or our basis of foundation aid by the formula. So one of the nice things is the state is coming forward with $800,000, and the legislature has put together a plan to bring our funding up over a 3-year time period. And this is really great. So it's good news. When there's really good news, what does a finance person do? You kind of look at it and say, well, is it really good news? And let's make sure, let's see where we are. Through our collective group in the state, what we've learned this year is that $800,000 is supported. The state is paying that with their support of federal monies. So, and that's money that they have available for this year. But as we know, these federal dollars are not recurring. They're one-time expenses. So we don't know how the state is going to be able to sustain and add to this level of funding over the next 3 years. Especially since we know, we sat on a webinar today, close to 12.6 billion or close to $13 billion of the state budget is backed by federal dollars this year. So next year, the state is at that cliff that we talk about. They've got a one-shot funding of $12.6 billion from the state, from the federal government. And they've got to find a way to fill that hole and add to it next year to bring up our level of foundation aid. So again, it's great. It gives us a moment, but it gives us a moment of pause because, the question is, what could we do with that $800,000? And here are some options, right? We have additional $800,000 in revenue. Without changing what the tax increase from the preliminary tax increase could be, you could add $800,000 in expenditures of additional programs. But right now, Dr. Champ, that's not something we're proposing. Right now,
that is correct, Jim. Thank you. We do not want to propose that at this time, given the unknown future of those funds in particular.
So we really have. Again, so we've got, and we're not proposing any other changes to the expenditure budget. So the expenditure budget that we're going to ask the board to vote on next week is the expenditure budget that was proposed. But this still leaves the question of what you can do with that additional $800,000. If you recall, and again, in part of our discussions of the budgets over the years, some of this $1.25 million of our revenue in the preliminary budget is made up of fund balance. And just to kind of remind everybody what fund balances are, in a very simplistic way, think of your fund balances as your savings account. And that's what 1.255 million of the school district's budget is supported by. So one option is you could apply that $800,000 to reduce the use of your fund balances, reduce the use of your savings account. And again, what you would have is you would have a balanced budget and your tax increase would be the same as was originally put in the preliminary budget. Another option is you could decide that you want to directly apply it to decrease your taxes, and then you would go under the tax cap by $800,000, say $800,000 if you're not adding any other program. The caution I would have there, though, is if this level of funding is not sustained at the state level, and now we've created a budget that counts on those dollars on a recurring basis, the district could find itself in a position where you need to, you'd be short, and you'd have to be with a tax cap, you'd be short, and you may have to try to pierce the tax cap. And if you remember, when you go above the tax cap, instead of the normal 50% majority pass a budget, 50% plus one, you need 60% plus one. So again, it's a super majority, or looking at another way, 40% of the voters, of those voting, can fail a budget when you're breaking the cap.
I'm sorry, Jim.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, from my conversations with the auditors, that's a scenario that they really caution us against. It
is, and when you pierce a cap, it's big news. There's not a lot of school districts in Westchester that pierce the cap or that have tried to pierce the cap, and when they have to, it creates a lot of certainly a lot of anxiety because the thought is if you're unsuccessful, then you have your options are you can reduce program, cut your expenses, or again backfill with more revenue, more fund balance savings of your savings account. But eventually you could run out of that savings and you find yourself on a bigger cliff. So you really would need to realign your budget if you're not able to pass, say, a tax cap, piercing a tax cap. That is not what we're proposing here. This is
Yeah,
just.
I want to be clear on that. Thank you.
I don't think we should spend too much time going down that road because nobody's suggesting that we.
Exactly. And this
Yeah,
is,
but I don't think we should leave the impression that just because we don't tax to the cap, we're automatically next year having to pierce the cap, because it's really not the case.
Yeah.
correct. Correct.
We have not taxed to the cap in a number of years in the past 10 years, and it has not resulted in catastrophic tax increases the following year. So I don't want to leave that impression that it's the inevitable result.
I think that's a good point. We don't want to give a sky is falling message all the time. I think that's appropriate. That's entirely true. And I think if we find out that the state aid level of funding can be sustained, I think that may be a time where you'd say, yeah, we don't need to tax to the cap. But this being the first year of that increased level of funding, knowing that it's supported with $12.6 billion of one-time federal money that we know of right now, my advice would be let's be cautious about this additional money and how we recognize it, and understand that the state doesn't have experience supporting this level of funding before, and they're starting from a $12.6 billion hole.
And I know, just to reiterate that, I know, and Jim, maybe you can speak to your professional groups too, the superintendents groups were having some of these very same conversations. And I think that the additional funding was a bit of a surprise on the front end, but all the superintendents I spoke with at our weekly meetings shared similar concerns and approach as far as planning how they may use these new foundation aid dollars, even though technically it's considered a recurring revenue. Everyone is approaching it very cautiously, knowing that it's not, and we're not convinced that the state will follow through on its 3-year promise.
But that doesn't leave us. I'm sorry, Mr. Bryce, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I don't want to dwell on this point. I just, in the past 9 years when there's been a tax cap, we have not taxed to the cap 5 of those 9 years. The past 4 years, probably, Jim, when you've been guiding the ship, we have, and I think that's a good thing to aspire to. But it's not the tail that wags the dog in my mind.
No, and I think we've done other things. Again, we've got a budget, like we said, that's supported with $1.255 million of fund balance. As you look at it, before you would tax under the cap, I would say let's get to a position where we're relying on that less. So you start off every year with a structurally 0-0 budget. You don't start in the hole every year when you're budgeting, so to speak. But I agree. There can be a time when you can go below the cap, and if you don't need to tax for it, and again, with these additional dollars, we don't see a need this year to create program or spend those additional $800,000 on an expense basis. If you don't need it, don't spend it, and we want to be judicious in the use of the taxpayers' dollars for sure. Kind of leaves us with where we left off at the last meeting, where I think the board kind of said it'd be really nice if we could get to a tax levy increase that begins with the 2. And again, just to start us back from where the preliminary budget was, proposes a year-to-year tax levy increase of 3.31%. If you recall, that's made up really of 2 parts. 1.7% of it is our kind of year-to-year recurring expenses of our operating, and the other balance of the 1.61% was the increased costs due to the debt service that we were bringing on as part of the $57 million bond. However, one of those things that we can use to help offset that tax increase and to bring it down is a use of one of our appropriated fund balances, and that is the use of our debt service fund. And if we take you back a minute, we're proposed using $1.1 million in the operating budget of debt service fund dollars. And based on the question that a board member challenged us with, which is what could we do to bring the budget down or the tax level increase down to a number that begins with a 2. If we increase that use of debt service fund from $1.1 million to $1.315 million, you could see a resulting tax levy increase year to year go down from 3.31% to 2.98%. So I'm just opening up a sheet here.
You said 2.98% in that
Yes.
scenario?
I'm sorry?
I just clarified 2.98% you said in that scenario.
I did say 2.98%, yes.
And the more we use of our debt service fund balance, the lower we can get that number.
You can, right. And so that gives the Board of Education the ability to lower the year-to-year tax levy increase while allocating a portion of the debt service fund. And just as we use with our fund balances to balance our budget year over year, at year end, those are the dollars that fill in whatever, if there's any shortfall at year end, obviously those dollars are drawn down. So, if you have a year where you don't need to draw them down, they're not. But you have to understand that if you appropriate them in a given year, there's the ability for them to be drawn down in full. And so like a debt service fund, if that were to be drawn down in full, that's certainly not available for the next year.
Can you also talk, Jim, to how this fund is replenished? Like right now, we don't have a way to replenish it. So the more we use of it, the less we have to use next year. And as we've talked in the past, we're looking at rounding out this curve as we ramp up the debt service that's coming on from the 2018 projects.
Yes. Funding or adding money to the debt service fund can really be done 3 ways. The first way is when a capital project is completed and you have residual borrowed monies that have gone unspent, those monies would fall down into the debt service fund. They would flow down into the debt service fund. That's one way. Another way you could add monies to your debt service fund is when you go out to borrow money. Sometimes in order to achieve a higher coupon rate on a bond, the borrower will also give you what they call a premium or monies up front. And those monies or that premium would then go into the debt service fund. Now there's specific rules on how those monies can be used though. The state is pretty specific and they've got to be used almost immediately when you receive those monies. The third way is on interest income from any monies that are in the debt service fund. So we all know what interest rates have been over the last decade or so. So we're not growing anything very fast on that, especially the way we have to put money in the bank. Jackie, what we're at 0.01, 0.02% interest rate?
Yeah, it's basically not worth even mentioning.
Yeah. So we're not growing the fund that way either. And you're right though. If you appropriate them and you have to use them, all of those dollars at year end, and as like with the savings account, those dollars are no longer available in the future. So hopefully this kind of frames it for you, gives you an idea and share with you what we know about the additional funding. Kind of, if you look at it, it's again, it's not exactly 800,000, but it's kind of split into two. That $1.6 million is really split into those 2 different $800,000 buckets. I think for this evening's conversation, it's really about that $800,000 of the increase in foundation aid. And then again, I can open myself up to questions and certainly discussions amongst yourselves. And if there's a consensus of the board or a thought of the board of where you think you'd like to go, we can then prepare for a final passage of the budget at the board meeting on April 21st. I don't know if I'm in control anymore if it's Jess.
What'd you say?
I don't
Oh,
know.
not Jess.
Yeah, I don't know if I call hands out.
Oh, the chart you sent out late
Yes.
today, that was really, really, really helpful. And what I noticed, I mean, immediately was, and I guess I knew this, but this really shows it very clearly, that it's not next year's budget where we see a big bump up in debt. It's the following years where we go from 3.4 million to 6.5 million in debt service for 22, 23. So I think, and the approach with the 2.98%, you know, holds out at least $685,000 for the following year, which really helps smooth out that. Now, I think projections past 2 years are kind of so speculative that, you know, that it's really hard to draw any conclusions from them. But I think going out to 22, 23 is really helpful in these scenarios to see what the impact is just from debt service use. That's that alone, but there's a lot of other moving parts in this, obviously. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you. Yeah, and the state has to do a long-range plan too. Of course, they're going to do that after the budget is set. So the board won't have that as information, and we won't have more information on how they exactly anticipate paying for everything in the future years. It'd be nice to be
Jim,
nice to get updated. I'm sorry,
Jim. My 2 cents here is, you know, these are pleasant surprises for our school district as well as the school districts in the state. I would propose that we do bring down the tax levy below 3 to the shareholders, to the stakeholders of this community. We're benefiting. I'd like to be able to give something back to them without taking too much of the debt service fund on a go-forward basis. So I believe that to go from 1.1 up to bring the number down, the tax levy down to 2.98 is fair. I'm cautiously optimistic that in the next few years we will be able to bring something to the debt service fund on a positive way. But I'd like to bring something to the community, to the shareholders, stakeholders of Pelham, if we can.
Mm-hmm. Great.
So,
Yeah, I'm looking at this as well too. I would agree. You know, I mean, I think that this is, you know, aggressive and conservative at the same time, right? So we're being aggressive to the extent that we can be this year because of the unexpected funding, but also being conservative going forward in that we're not setting up future boards for debt service payments that that can't be managed or smoothed a bit. So I agree that the charts are really extremely helpful in the way they're laid out.
Jess?
I thought Eileen was before me.
Oh, I looked up and saw 2 hands. I'm sorry. Just why don't you go and then?
No, okay. Yeah, I think I agree with what Sue's saying in these charts, Jim. Thank you for providing them. At the end of the day, it helps to look at the next year when we're talking about increasing our debt service fund, which we only have like 1.9 million in right now. So when we bump that number up, you know, we obviously have less to use next year to help. I agree that the bringing under 3 is good. And as Sue was saying, I think you said optimistically conservative or something like that. But I think I think that's good. I mean, I wonder if we could. I think that's the safe lane. I wonder if we could go a little bit lower and still be okay with it. But I'd want to hear how everyone else on the board felt.
Eileen?
So I agree with what Vinny said, that this, you know, we're kind of lucked into some of this money unexpectedly, and we'd like to pass that along. And I'd like to add on to that, though, that this has been a very difficult year for a lot of people in Pelham. I don't think that this is the year to to not go as deep as we can go. And so I was really hoping for the 2.09. I understand what that does to our debt service fund, but just from the 3 years that I've been on the board, I feel like there are often pleasant surprises at the end of the year. And I would suggest we bank on that. But I think the 2.5 is good too. I think 2.98 is not low enough. That's my feeling.
How do others feel about that? Or I see Leah's hand up, I'm sorry.
So I think I'm sort of thinking similarly to Eileen. I initially was thinking that 2.09 was too low. That made me nervous to leave nothing in the debt service fund. That didn't seem like a wise thing to do. I'm not sure the difference between 2.98 and 3.31 is as significant to the community. And I too am very mindful of the hardship that a lot of people have gone through this year financially. But I think it's that maybe we should talk about it a little more, what the difference between the 2.99 and 2.5 would mean, Jim. I can see it on the numbers, but maybe we should also talk
Right.
about it for people.
So I guess, again, what just so frame of reference, there's a worksheet that we've shared with the board before, and we updated a little bit, kind of gives you the effects of the debt service fund appropriation on the tax cap. And kind of lets you know that if you use $1.1 million of your debt service fund, your tax will be 3.31%, and that was the preliminary budget. But also gives the board some sensitivity as to what the tax levy or the year-to-year tax increase would be if you would added additional debt service fund dollars, all the way up to using $1.9 million of those debt service fund dollars. And it's really, it kind of gives you an idea. So again, if you were looking at a tax rate of say 2.55%, you would want to appropriate $500,000 more of that debt service fund. And again, the key here though is, and it's important to remember, once those dollars are appropriated, and if you appropriate them, you want to assume that they would be used in the following year. They're then no longer available, right? It's a one-time occurrence. So.
Well, Jim, but are you saying that they have to be used, or that you should assume that they're going to?
You should assume that they'd use. Certainly, if you're in a year where you don't need to draw them down, where your operating results are positive, you're not required to draw them down. But again, from a planning perspective, you have to understand that if they are used, they're no longer available.
Understood, but we have had years, including this year, where we have not used them.
That's correct.
It's an important distinction to make, I think.
Yeah.
It is, and I think it's important, especially for someone in my position, and for you as board members, to understand that, right? That's part of our responsibility, and making sure that you understand what the circumstances that could happen.
Of course, and I think anything that we put forward for the year, the expectation should be that it's being used. But I just want to make the distinction that we do not have to use it, and this year we have not used it because we are expecting a surplus for all the reasons that we talked about. So, Eileen, I think that's part of what you were getting at earlier, right?
That is what I'm saying. That it feels like we often have either we have a surplus that either ends up being a surplus, or there's another opportunity to spend those funds on something important, like for instance the house. But I think that my recollection of all of it, and just looking at some of the numbers, is that we've had surpluses a lot, and I think that if we only draw down 163, we already have 370 in, plus some kind of a surplus. When I look at that number with the 2.98 scenario, I feel badly we didn't use that money this year.
It feels we could do better, right? I
Right.
see Leah's hand up in my right-hand corner. Leah,
Sorry, that was old. I should take it down. I
Okay.
apologize.
put your hand down.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I think we should be lower than the 2.98, the high twos, but I think I'm hesitant a little bit for the low twos, just because I see that we are getting this extra money from the state, and there's potential that we will have surpluses in the future, but I'm nervous about taking everything out of the debt service fund, knowing that we still have another uptick that's happening next year with our borrowing coming on. But I do think I am comfortable going lower, going at least mid. Maybe there's somewhere in between mid and low too.
John?
Yeah, do you have any sense, Jim, of what opportunity we have in terms of the amount of money that we might be able to use to replenish the debt service reserve? What's the scale that we might?
Right, so you can't use your end of year surplus to replenish your debt service fund.
Understood.
Like and your other fund balances.
Right.
What can happen though, and a circumstance like this year, is we've programmed to use about $344,000 of debt service fund this year, but we don't think we'll have to. So then those dollars are reserved to be used at a later time. So it's not spending the money, which in effect is a way to hold it there and use it at a later date.
So that's a scenario we could see play out next year as well. Possibility.
So it could happen, right? And this is the caution part of me saying it could happen. Just understand that it could not. There's circumstances where it may not happen, and that's just where if that were to play out, your subsequent year tax increases wouldn't be able to benefit from that because those dollars would be spent. There would be other levers to pull. We have other fund balances, and you could again impact your tax rate in other ways. But for debt service monies, those dollars would no longer be available if they were all used.
Right, and then also in 2 to 3 years, when the bond work is complete, there will be the benefits from your amazing work on borrowing that will then slide into the debt service fund.
Well, you're right. We've done our borrowing, and we've had a pretty impressive bidding environment, and at this point where we sit now, it doesn't look like every dollar is going to be spent. And again, those residual dollars, once the books are closed and the file cabinet's closed, those residual dollars, any residual dollars that were spent, would go into the debt service fund. Probably 2 to 3 years out on that. But you're exactly right. That would actually help coincide with a drop off in some state aid that we're seeing. I believe it's in the 25-26 year. So, at a time like that, that's when you could perhaps use those dollars at that point in time.
Sue? Sue, did you have something?
Sorry, I took my hand down because I was just going to reiterate the point that Eileen was making about the benefits of any underspend on the current bond projects going back to the fund. So a combination of a surplus next year, plus any funds that are able to be underspent on the bond going back in, could have the same kind of impact on our use of debt service fund in that next year.
Absolutely. Vinny, and then John.
Okay. I hear everything that you're saying, but being an ex-accountant or an old accountant, whatever you want to call me, I hate using reserves. I hate using them. I think they distort your financials to an extent. But Jim, you answered my question about the monies that were set aside earmarked for this year that doesn't look like it'll be used at 344. I'd be happy to use that to reduce, use that to bring the number midway down between the 2.98 and the 2.09, which is kind of what Jessica was saying before.
That's actually that's an interesting idea. Yeah.
We do have that option here. In the sheets that Jim sent us just this afternoon, there's the 2.98, the 2.09, and a 2.5.
That's
Yeah.
right. So what I wanted
is
what
about
we
3%
did,
more.
yeah, what we wanted to do is kind of give the board a visual on what the impact could be on that of using the debt service fund on out years, and what it could look like again with the 5-year forecast, just updating it. And I think Jackie puts up with me. I kind of called it the Goldilocks. The Goldilocks, one's really high, one's really low, and one's kind of in between. But it's it would, so if you were looking for a tax levy at 2.5% growth year over year, you'd use $1.63 million of debt service fund dollars next year.
Maybe.
And again, as you can see on the out year, if you assume you
you'd
use
budget
all
for
of
it,
them,
maybe is the better word. Budget for
it
it.
certainly drops that number. If the out year tax increase is lower than it would be if you would use the full amount.
John.
I mean, I certainly appreciate Vinny's point. My original concern with this is to get everything below 3. So I'm glad that we're talking about that. Whether
I'm
it
sorry,
goes
John, what did you say? Get everything what?
get it below
Below
3.
Below 3.
Below 3.
And now
And
we're speaking all scenarios that John was hoping for.
yes, so any of those actually make me happy. But I'm inclined to push it a little lower than the 2.98 because I think that we will have the flexibility next year. We certainly are seeing a growth in our reserve funds as a result of, the largesse of the state and other things. So, I think we're maintaining very healthy reserves. So the issue with this is it's one particular reserve, which can only be used for one thing. And so we're spending all this time talking about this one thing, which, we have a whole host of other levers to pull, if you will. So I'm certainly supportive of going lower if that's the sense of the board.
It's an important thing to focus on, though, because as we spoke about at our last meeting, even though the community voted for our bond a few years back, it's like every year with budgetary tax levy increases due to the bond, projects, it almost becomes a referendum every year. So I think it is worthy to be conscious. I know it was something that we were mindful of last year in the context of where we were with the pandemic. So I think it's important to be conscious of that factor, along with some of the things that have worked in our favor and some of the unknowns that we have coming down the pike. So I'm inclined to kind of find the porridge that's just right if it were up to me. I don't know how others feel, though, in terms of finding a spot. I agree that below 3 is important. Something kind of in the middle that certainly preserves a bit more of our reserves, our debt service reserves, feels better to me.
Jim, I have a quick question. In this sheet that we're all looking at that shows us the future years, I don't see on here, where would foundation aid be on here? Did you assume that we weren't going to continue to get more, or we were going to continue to get what we got this year, or?
Right, so as you would look, where are we here? You look at your principal aid equals. No, this is really your tax cap forecast year over year, so you wouldn't see it on this particular sheet. It just shows you what your prior year levy is, and kind of we made some assumptions on our growth factor, what inflation would be. I think we made an assumption of 2%, and then played into effect what the debt service would be. We know what the debt service is and the net local share.
Yeah.
And with that, I mean, again, we did it. And I think you make an important point. Their forecasts, their projections,
Right.
there's a number of variables and things change. This again is to kind of give you an understanding of the sensitivity that it could happen. And I think Mr. Bryce made a very good point that there are levers that can be pulled at a later point. It's not like this is the last lever too. That's just that is a fact, and I don't want to make it look like we're hiding that fact. It's we know what it is.
But so so I'm clear, we are hopeful that we will continue to get increased foundation aid, and that would be upside here.
Absolutely, I think if we see sustained increased foundation aid, that's when I think you get to a point where taxpayers can really see some relief. Because again, let's go back to our preliminary budget. It was $3.5 million of foundation aid, which is really just a little bit over 50%. We should have been close to $7 million. That's a healthy difference there. And if the state is actually saying we're going to get to that full amount, I think that's really terrific. It's kind of but can they get to that amount? I know they wrote the law to get to that level, and I guess part of me thinks they can write the law to get themselves out of having to fund that level if they don't have the money. We know they've put into effect new income taxes, different recreational taxes for things like marijuana, but we don't know what the tax generation is going to be there. And again, it's $12.6 billion of the state budget is backed by federal dollars. So before they can even, to meet what they're doing this year, they've got to generate $12.6 billion because that's their whole. And then they've got to handle normal growth when they build their budget next year. And then they have to build in what their commitment is to bring us up to the foundation aid level. And I think year over year, the increase in the foundation aid, I've got a sheet here, I think it was something like $1.2 billion. I'm going to look through it. I'm going to be quiet and look through it, and I'll be able to confirm it. Excuse me. $1.4 billion is what the increase in foundation aid is to the state this year.
Jim, just one follow-up to what you said, and then I see Leah's hand is up. The foundation aid being sustainable, how many years out would you determine that we can size some relief on that front? Like, are you talking see them, fund us further for the next 2 years? Is it 3 years? Is it?
Well, I think if we're at this point next year and there's another $800,000, then I think you may have to look at that first $800,000 and say, it looks like it's going to stay. It looks like it's going to be here, provided the money is generated by the state and not another infusion of cash from the federal government.
So you would say it's the same increase plus sustained by the state, not because of funding from the federal level too.
Right. That's my biggest concern with this $800,000 in the increase in federal and foundation aid.
How the state's funding it.
How the state's going to sustain that level.
Yeah. Leah?
Yeah, so I mean, like any other decision that we make, we can only make the best decision that we can based on the information we have. And now we have a lot more information. So I feel like we're making a much more informed decision than we were a few weeks ago. But I also feel like, to reflect what both of the Jessicas say, we have to balance wanting to make sure that we are responsive to the community's concerns and being responsible in that regard, but also responsible to the long-term health of the district. So it seems like Jessica's porridge analogy makes sense to me, that to come below 3, but somewhere in the middle, so that who knows what's going to happen next year. Hopefully everything is moving in a terrific direction financially and health-wise, and everything will be great, and the state will be able to fund us, and we'll be having this conversation next year about a very low increase, but we don't know what's going to happen. So I feel like with the information we have, we go with the porridge that's just right. That's I think.
Yeah, I agree. I like Vinny's idea of taking the unspent the rough unspent number this year, adding it to the original number we had talked about, and coming out somewhere in the middle, which I think is basically, interestingly, pretty much what others are saying, will get us to that middle point or close to it.
Does that sound like a good plan to everybody else?
Just to be clear, that's a 2.5%. Is that what we're talking?
Right around there, John.
Roughly.
Okay. Well, I don't feel compelled to be using exactly 345,000. So if it takes 375,000,
I was just speaking in rough numbers, not exact.
The general
I think it's actually a little bit less, right? Like it's
that's fine. I just, I think a number that people can understand of 2.5% or 2.49% even.
Right.
We should just go by that.
You're clearly not an accountant, John.
You're right. I'm not.
I was fine with 2.5, but if Vinny wants to spend another 344, then imagine how low it will get.
No, that's
so really you're looking at, if you're looking to get in the 2.5 range, you're looking at another $500,000. And I understand that's generally where you're looking to go, with the assumption really that you've got some unspent dollars from this year that you're able to carry forward and adding a little bit more to it.
It seems like a very responsible use of that money.
Got it.
I agree.
So we'll get to
Jim and Jackie. I want to thank Jim and Jackie again for all of the work on this. I mean, we've gotten more information in such a short period of time than I think any year, at least that I've been involved with the board. So it's a lot. So thank you.
Well,
I agree. And Jackie, I forgot to thank you at the beginning. I think it was because I had Jim in mind to tee up to start this conversation, but I know that you are, no offense to Jim, the backbone of the operation. And I saw you in your office late at night last night. So we thank you and Jim and your whole office and others who I'm not thanking. This is a busy season for you guys. So thanks.
Thank you. We got a great Jackie.
I really want to thank you both for the private tutoring that has gone on.
And I think that Jackie could probably offer some classes in school budget finance people. Maybe they should add that to the board training.
There you go.
That's for sure.
And don't forget, they moved in the middle of all this. These last 3 weeks, the entire office moved into 314 Pelhamdale. So
Yeah.
really, truly incredible work, Jackie and Jim. Thank you so much. It's
Thank you both.
I think what we all needed.
Thanks very much.
Jim, did we give you enough? Oh, sorry, John.
I just want to add my thanks and just say that, if we're able to maintain our tax cap and still get this thing down well below 2 or well below 3, I think it's a big accomplishment. And I want to thank Jim and Jackie both for this.
Agreed.
You gave them a challenge, John. So we appreciate it.
Thanks. and I thank you. And again, I know you're sensitive to your community, and you hear from your community, and certainly you shared that with us, and it gives us an opportunity to provide the students what they need for the next year, and help our resident taxpayers too.
So Jim, you feel like we've given you enough to bring back to us next week, and next week we fully approve the budget that we will propose. That's when we take a formal vote, correct?
That's correct.
At the board level on what we're going to propose to the community for vote.
That's right, and that gets all the formal stuff. We'll have it ready a week from now for our for our hat trick meeting, three in a row.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, very good.
Thanks for reminding us.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, and thank you, Jackie, again. We had everything worked out. A lot of work, and it's good. I'm glad you're comfortable with the information you've received and this process.
Great. So Eileen.
Madam President, sorry.
I'll take secretary.
I don't know what I was thinking. Would you entertain a motion to adjourn?
So moved. Do I have a second?
Did we have a public comment period, Jess?
Oh, whoops.
I haven't
We-
received, I don't believe I received any. Let me look.
Yeah, just wanted to double check. Sorry, Eileen.
No,
I couldn't get
good
to,
point.
I couldn't
I
get to
jumped-
my unmute fast enough.
I jumped the gun, but we haven't received any public comment. So
Great. Proceed.
So-
Thank you.
thank you for reminding me though, because I didn't look at my email. So again, Sue was the second. Any questions or comments? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, see you guys next week. Thank you.
Good night.
Aye.
Thanks so much,
Good night.
everybody.
Bye.